chained at the wrists and left to bake in a July sun. What it would cost the men who put her there is a story. Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, spent 20 years trying to drink out of its head and never quite could, because the drifter who cut Sadie Coyle free that morning was a man 4 territories were trying to hang. Stay with me tonight. This is the story of a forged ledger, a widow's 12 acres, and the quietest gunfighter anyone in the New Mexico Territory ever made the mistake of underestimating. My name is not important. I was the youngest deputy in Harlan's Crossing in the summer of 1883, green enough that I still believed a registered document from Santa Fe meant something clean. I was there for all of it, start to finish, and I have been carrying it in my chest ever since, and tonight I am setting it down. Sadie Coyle was the kind of woman a town like Harlan's Crossing did not quite know how to classify. Her husband, Pastor Jonas Coyle, had died in February of that year, a fever that took him in 4 days, clean and fast the way fevers rarely are. He left her the mission house on the East Road, 12 acres of flat fertile land that the county surveyor had assessed at $900 in 1881, a vegetable garden that kept half the poorer families fed through the cold months, and a reputation that the ladies of the Methodist Auxiliary considered, with some delicacy, a little too self-sufficient for a widow of 29. She had dark hair that she wore pinned up except on Sundays, brown eyes with the kind of steadiness behind them that comes from years of listening to people say the things they would not say in daylight. Her hands were careful and strong, the hands of a woman who fixed her own fence posts and kept her own ledger in a handwriting so exact that the county surveyor had once, with professional admiration, asked her to draft a land map for him. She accepted his fee and donated it to the mission's winter fund. That ledger, the one she kept, would matter greatly before the summer was out. By June, the Rio Grande Railroad had sent a land agent north from Santa Fe. His name was Thaddeus Roper, and he arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a Palomino horse wearing a black suit that had cost more than most families here saw in 3 months. He was 42, built heavy through the shoulders, with small pale eyes set close together under thick brows, and a habit of smiling just after he had said something that was not a joke. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that is very sure of where the exits are. Roper carried papers. He always carried papers. They were, in his experience, more reliable than guns. The railroad wanted a right-of-way. The planned spur line north from Albuquerque to Cimarron passed directly through the east side of Harlan's Crossing, and the east side of Harlan's Crossing was in large part Sadie Coyle's 12 acres. The mission house sat just far enough north to clear the proposed route, but the flat acreage behind it, the land Jonas had purchased legally and paid for in full in 1877, receipts clear and county filed, sat directly in the path of the planned track. Roper visited her twice in the first week. The first visit was cordial. He explained the railroad's position, presented a figure that was less than half the land's assessed value, and left a card on her table the way a man does when he fully expects the next call to be answered. Sadie thanked him, offered him coffee, and showed him to the door. The second visit, 4 days later, was not cordial. He brought 2 of his men that time. The one they called Dutch was built like a cattle barn, broad-faced, slack-jawed, a man who had spent his life discovering that his size resolved most problems before they could fully form. He stood on the step outside Sadie's front door and scratched the back of his neck and looked at the mission yard with the heavy blankness of a man who is paid to loom until things happen. The other man's name was Cobb, thin, dark, with ink-stained fingers and quick dry eyes that moved over everything in a room the way a surveyor's eyes move over land, measuring, pricing, recording. Cobb was Roper's legal architect, his instrument maker, and for the past 14 months he had been practicing a very specific skill with the discipline of a craftsman. The forging of property debt instruments in the specific style of rural New Mexico county clerks. He was particular about ink. He was particular about the angle of his nib strokes. He had a collection of authentic county stamps that he had acquired through a contact in Santa Fe, and he used them with care. The document he had prepared, the one Roper laid on Sadie's kitchen table that second afternoon, claimed that Jonas Coyle had borrowed $460 from the Territorial Land Trust of New Mexico in the autumn of 1880 to cover the purchase cost of the east parcel, and that the trust's creditor rights had passed through a chain of registered transactions to Rio Grande Railroad land holdings, and that the debt, with 3 years of accrued interest, now stood at $712.40, and that the 12-acre parcel was the named collateral. Sadie read it twice. The kitchen was quiet, except for the flies against the window screen. She looked up at Roper and set the paper on the table between them. "This is not Jonas's hand. I know his hand. He wrote in it every day for 16 years. Roper placed his fingers flat on the table, a gesture that was meant to be conclusive. "The document is registered with the county clerk in Santa Fe, ma'am." "Then Santa Fe has been sold a lie." He collected the paper without changing his expression, told her she had 30 days to settle or vacate, and put his hat on. Dutch followed without ever having looked directly at her. Cobb paused at the door and looked back at the kitchen, at Jonas's record box on the shelf, with the measuring dry eyes of a man who is cataloging obstacles. Then he pulled the door shut behind him. The house was very quiet after they left. Sadie stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface where Roper's hands had been, and looked at the window and at the yard beyond it, and at the cedars along the south fence, and at the 12 acres that Jonas had spent 3 growing seasons clearing and working into something that fed people. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to the desk and started writing her first letter to Santa Fe. The 30 days passed in a particular kind of dread, the kind that does not announce itself every moment, but sits in the background of everything, the way a low sound sits under a room. Sadie wrote 3 letters, one to the county clerk's office in Santa Fe, one to the office of the territorial governor, one to a lawyer in Albuquerque whose name Jonas had mentioned once in passing, a man Jonas thought was honest. The county clerk's office returned a form acknowledgement. The governor's office returned nothing. The lawyer returned nothing, or if he did, the letter did not arrive in Harlan's Crossing. On the morning of the 31st day, Roper returned with all 3 of his men. The third enforcer's name was Peach, which suited him less than any name she could have invented for him. He was raw-boned and dark from the sun, with a mouth that turned down at the corners even in repose, and he moved with the unhurried economy of a man who has been doing physical work all his life and wastes nothing on it. He carried a length of heavy link chain looped over his left shoulder, 6 feet of it with iron ring cuffs at one end, the way a working man carries a coil of rope. He had prepared the cuffs that morning, testing the hinges, oiling the lock, the way a careful tradesman prepares his tools. It was Peach who walked Sadie out of her own house. He had a hand on her upper arm, and he held it the way you hold something you don't want to injure, but intend to move. The mission yard was quiet. 2 women from the Mexican quarter were drawing water at the well 20 yards off, and both of them went very still when they saw what was happening. Sadie looked at them. One of them looked away. The other held her gaze for a moment, then looked away too. The rail yard post was a thick pine 8 feet high at the edge of the siding, the one they used to tie horses to on loading days, with iron rings bolted at shoulder height and weathered smooth from years of use. Peach locked the chain through both rings and through the cuffs on her wrists, and did it without looking at her face. The way men do when they know they are performing an act they will need to not remember. The chain was long enough that she could stand or crouch, but not sit, and it rattled when she moved with a sound that carried across the rail yard. Cobb nailed the sign above her head. He had lettered it himself, in paint, block letters wide enough to read from a saddle. Thief. Owes debt to rightful creditor. Do not assist. It was not yet 8 in the morning. The July sun in New Mexico does not ask permission. By 9 o'clock, the shadow of the post had shortened to almost nothing. By 10, the iron cuffs had soaked up enough heat to leave faint burns on the inside of her wrists, where the metal contacted skin. Her dress was dark at the back and at the neckline. She held herself straight, chin up, and watched the road. I was standing in front of the deputy's office across the road. I watched every person walk by. 400 people lived in Harlan's Crossing, roughly. 98 of them used the main road that morning. I counted because there was nothing else I could do with my hands. Counting was something to do instead of the thing I already knew I could not do. Sheriff Alderman had been clear, precise, and final about it. The debt instrument was registered with the county clerk in Santa Fe. The writ of civil enforcement was signed by a sitting territorial judge, and interference constituted obstruction of lawful process. He had looked at me when he said it with the expression of a man who had already made his calculation and was not going to recalculate. So I stood and counted. Men who had shaken Jonas Coyle's hand at Sunday service walked past. A woman who had borrowed Sadie's mother's preserving jars walked past with her eyes set straight ahead. 3 boys who had eaten from the mission soup pot all last winter walked past, each of them finding something urgent to look at on the far side of the road. A minister from the Baptist congregation walked past, crossed himself, and kept walking. Roper had done this before, not in Harlan's Crossing, but in Lordsburg, in Las Cruces, in a place in Arizona territory that I won't name. The process was reliable. File the paper, create the public display, let the town absorb the spectacle, wait for the will to resist to collapse under the weight of its own isolation. In both of the previous towns, it had worked. Nobody had been willing to stand between a chained woman and a Santa Fe writ. Harlan's Crossing almost didn't produce anyone either. The drifter came in from the south around midday, when the heat was at its full weight, and the road shimmered in both directions as far as you could see. He was riding a gray horse with the solid, thick build of an animal that crosses long distances on short grass. The horse moved at an easy walk, unhurried, stepping around the worst of the ruts the way a seasoned traveler does it, not avoiding work, just not adding unnecessary effort to the day. The man on its back was lean, probably 35, maybe older, the way men who live outdoors become ageless in a certain range. He wore a trail coat that had been good once and was still functional, a hat that weather had shaped to a particular geometry of its own. He wore a Colt on his right hip and a long-bladed knife on the left, in a plain leather sheath with a worn brass cap at the bottom. No badge, no adornment, nothing that announced anything. He saw the post before he was 30 yards from it. He sat on the horse and looked at the sign. He looked at Sadie. He looked at the three men standing at varying distances from her. Dutch close, Peach to the right, Cobb back near the office wall with a ledger in his hand, recording the morning's work. The drifter sat very still on the horse for a moment, doing some kind of arithmetic in his head, and then he swung down with the ease of a man who has done this 40,000 times, dropped his reins over the saddle horn, and walked toward the post. Dutch stepped into his path. "Private business," Dutch said. "Railroad civil matter. Keep moving." The drifter stopped 2 feet in front of Dutch and looked up at him without urgency. Dutch stood 4 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier and was accustomed to this being the end of a conversation. It was not the end of this one. "That woman needs water," the drifter said, "and those chains need to come off." Dutch put one hand flat on the drifter's chest. The drifter looked at the hand. He looked at it for a moment with the calm patience of a man who has already played this through to its conclusion and is simply waiting for the world to arrive where he already is. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a flat tin canteen. He held it out toward Sadie. Dutch grabbed for his arm. What followed happened in a time so short that most of the people who witnessed it could not accurately reconstruct the sequence. There was a sound like green wood splitting. Dutch was on the ground on his back, with his hands pressed to his face. The drifter was standing with the canteen still in his hand. Peach and Cobb had both gone very still. The drifter held the canteen to Sadie's lips and let her drink. He did not rush her. He waited while she drank twice, 3 times, until she pulled back and took a breath. He capped the canteen and put it away, and then he produced the knife from his left hip and cut the locking chain with one flat pull of the blade, his wrist rotating inward, the way you cut a cord under tension. The sound it made was brief and final. The iron cuffs still needed a key. He turned to look at Peach. Peach reached into his shirt pocket without being asked and held the key out. He unlocked the cuffs. Sadie held her freed wrists out in front of her for a moment, turning them over, looking at the red marks the iron had made, marks that would fade in a week. She looked at them the way you look at part of yourself that you were afraid for. He crouched in front of her to be at eye level. "Can you walk?" She straightened her back and met his gaze. "Yes." "Then walk toward your house. Don't stop for anything, and don't look back at these men." She walked. He straightened and turned to face the 3 enforcers. Dutch now hauling himself to sitting in the dust, Peach and Cobb both still and hands visible, in the manner of men who are recalibrating quickly. He stood there without moving until Sadie was through the mission gate and the sound of her door closing reached him across the yard. Then he looked at all 3 of them in a single, patient sweep. "Tell Roper the woman is free and the chains are off. Tell him anyone he sends back here after dark is going to have a very long conversation with me before sunrise. Tell him I mean that exactly the way it sounds." Cobb worked his jaw. "Do you have any idea who you are crossing?" The drifter's face did not change by a single line. "Yes. Do you?" They didn't answer that. The answer, had they known it, would have changed the rest of the afternoon considerably. Before we go any further, because this is the moment where the story turns and the reason it turns has to come with it, I need to tell you what I know about who Levi was, not his last name. In 10 days in Harlan's Crossing, he never offered it, and in 40 years of looking I have found only rumors about it. So I am leaving it out. But I knew his face. Every deputy in the territory above Albuquerque had been passed a physical description of him at one point or another, and the description fit the man at the post the way a key fits a lock. Levi, no last name in the records. Warrants in 4 territories: Texas, Colorado, Arizona, and Missouri. The warrants were filed, every one of them, by railroad companies, mining operations, or land speculation firms. Not one charge of robbery, not one charge of murder. The offenses were things like interference with lawful foreclosure, assault on a company agent, destruction of registered documents. In at least 3 cases, the documents he had destroyed were later found to be forgeries. He had stood before a judge exactly once, in Tucson in 1880, and the judge had read the case, read Levi's counter-argument, prepared without a lawyer, in plain handwriting, on 2 pages, and dismissed it. The judge was removed from his position the following year, for reasons the official record attributed to unrelated matters. Here, now, is the thing about Levi that Roper did not know and should have found out before he chose a property in Harlan's Crossing. Before the drifting, before the warrants, Levi had spent 6 years as a brand inspector for the Texas Cattle Association. Not the kind who rode out and checked marks in the field, though he did that too. He was the one the association sent when someone had worked out how to alter or counterfeit the brand books, the kind of inspector who sat at a desk with a magnifying glass and a set of authentic records and found the places where the imitation came apart. He had a gift for it, the particular kind of attention that notices the small, wrong things that people who are nearly right do not notice themselves. He had dismantled cattle brand fraud operations in 4 counties before he was 30. He had a specialist's eye for ink, for paperweight, for the way a genuine stamp differs from a reproduction in ways you cannot describe, but can see once you know where to look. He had walked away from the association in 1877. His father's ranch in East Texas had been taken by a land company through forged transfer documents and a bought judge, and Levi had come home to find his father sitting on the step of a house he no longer owned. A man who had worked that ground for 30 years, reduced to a man sitting on a step. Levi had not been able to undo it. The transfer was complete. The money was moved. The courts in that county were solid. What he had done instead was leave and ride and use what he knew. He found the cases the way a hunting dog finds a scent, by moving through the territory and paying attention to what people told in low voices in dry goods stores and barber shops. He went where the railroad companies were moving. He went where the land companies were filing. He sat with the families who were receiving documents they did not understand, and he looked at those documents with the inspector's eye, and he found the forgeries, and he helped the people build the cases that could undo them. He was not always successful. Some of the judges were already bought. Some of the documents had been manufactured with enough care that the flaw was subtle to the point of being unprovable without laboratory analysis that did not exist yet in the territories. But he was successful often enough that the companies had learned to file warrants on him as a matter of standard procedure, the way you put poison in a field to keep a particular kind of animal out of it. Sadie's mission house had a kitchen, a parlor, a back bedroom, and the small office where Jonas had kept his records, and she had kept hers since his death. Levi went to that office first, once he was certain that Roper's men had pulled back from the property. He sat at Jonas's desk and spread the railroad's forged document alongside 2 of Jonas's authentic receipts from 1880, the ones Sadie had found in the tin document box in the bottom drawer, signed and notarized with the county clerk's stamp from that year. The forged clerk's seal was very good. The notary stamp was convincing. Cobb had copied the signature in the careful copper plate he'd spent 14 months developing, and it was a good copy. Most people looking at it would see nothing wrong. But the ink was wrong. Not the color, which Cobb had matched well. The depth, the way the ink sat in the paper fibers. Cobb had used a commercial steel nib formula that had come into common use in New Mexico after 1881. Jonas's authentic 1880 documents were written with a carbon-based quill ink that the local mercantile had stocked until it was replaced by the steel nib formula the following year. The older ink pooled at the stroke ends in a characteristic way, a slight bleed at the termination of each letter that the steel nib formula did not replicate. Under Sadie's sewing kit magnifying glass, the difference was not small. There was a second flaw. Cobb was meticulous, but not meticulous enough to catch this one. The New Mexico Territorial Clerk's Office had changed its date notation format in January of 1881, switching from day-month-year to month-day-year to comply with a federal record-keeping recommendation. The document Cobb had forged, purportedly dated in autumn of 1880, used the post-1881 format. To anyone who knew the history of the clerk's office, it was definitive. A document signed in 1880 cannot use a date format that was not adopted until 1881. Levi set the magnifying glass down on Jonas's desk and sat back. "It's forged." He looked across at her. "You already knew that." She had her hands flat on the desk surface, her composure intact by what was clearly an act of accumulated will over a long afternoon. "I knew Jonas never signed it, but knowing and proving are different animals." "They are. Do you have tax records from 1880? Anything with the county clerk's official stamp from that period?" She had 3 tax receipts, a deed of purchase, and a confirmation letter from the Territorial Land Office, all from between 1877 and 1881. Levi laid them out and went through them methodically with the glass, while Sadie put coffee on the iron stove and watched him work without interrupting, the two of them in a quiet that was more comfortable than it had any reason to be between two people who had met 3 hours ago. He worked until the sun went behind the ridge and the kitchen went amber and the coffee was long past hot. He sat with the glass in his hand and the lamp oil burning low and told her what he'd found. The ink was wrong for 1880. The date format was wrong for any document before 1881. Either flaw alone was disputable. Both together, demonstrated against the authentic receipts in her tin box, were not. Any court that looks at both documents with a competent examiner and a magnifying glass is going to see it, he said. The question is getting to that court. Roper's court in Santa Fe already looked at it, in Roper's office without your 1880 records on the table. He set the glass down. That is a different thing from open court with your receipts side by side and someone pointing at the ink date by date. She turned her coffee cup on the table. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. "Who are you?" He looked at the lamp flame a moment. "Someone who has seen this kind of paper before." That was as much as he would say that evening. She did not press him. There was something in the way he worked, the patience and the precision of it, that told her the question would answer itself if she waited, and she had learned from Jonas that some answers were worth waiting for. That first evening he slept in the barn. Not because she hadn't offered the spare room, but because he wanted to be able to hear what came up the road in the dark, and the barn put him closer to the roadside of the property. He lay in the hayloft with the colt loose on the boards beside him and listened to the night. An owl worked the cedar beyond the fence. The horses moved in their stalls. The road was quiet. Around 2 a.m, a single horse came up the road from the south, walking slow. It stopped at the edge of the mission property. Levi watched the darkness for perhaps 3 minutes. Then the horse turned and went back the way it came, unhurried, the hoofbeats fading north until they were gone. He noted it and went back to sleep. In the morning he sat across from Sadie at the kitchen table and laid out what he intended to do, the way he would explain a repair to a person whose house it was. The first item was the land itself. The south fence, where the rail yard abutted the property, had a wire strand that Roper's men had walked through twice during their visits, treating it as decoration. Levi would restore it and add persuasions. Nothing that looked like a fortification. Wire at ankle height in the dark scrub between the fence posts. A gate latch that operated simply from the outside but had a secondary catch that would not give under pressure. 3 spots along the south and east fence lines where a man moving quickly in the dark would stop moving quickly without being killed, but with significant cause to reconsider his evening. The second item was documentation. He needed copies of both the forged paper and Sadie's authentic 1880 records in the hands of someone outside the reach of Roper's money, and he needed them quickly. There was a federal land commissioner in Santa Fe named Hargrove, who had a reputation for not being reached, a man who had cost a mining company a great deal of money 2 years ago by refusing to approve a filing that was, by Levi's understanding, legitimately fraudulent. Levi would write a letter to Hargrove. Sadie would write one too in her own words, in that careful copper plate. The letters would go by separate riders, on different roads. The third item was the document itself. A daguerreotypist in Albuquerque, a man Levi knew by name and trusted by experience, could make exact visual copies of both sets of papers, the forged railroad document and the authentic 1880 receipts that could be presented simultaneously in multiple courts if the case required it. The daguerreotypes could also be examined under magnification, and the ink differences would be visible in the print. Levi would need to make the trip himself, 2 days south and 2 days back. He did not love the idea of leaving her alone for 4 days. She did not love the idea either, which she expressed by not saying anything about it for a moment, and then asking when he would be back. She took the tin cup off the stove and filled both their cups without asking. He looked up from the plan he'd laid out on the table. 3 days, he said. 4 if the road is bad south of Socorro. She told him she understood the math. 3 days until the daguerreotypes were made and the contacts were reached. What comes in 3 days if Roper moves while you're gone? He told her Roper would try the paper route again first, another filing, another notice, another document to sign and surrender to. She was to accept anything handed to her, write down the time and the name of the person presenting it, and set it on the table for him to look at when he got back. Don't sign. Don't acknowledge the debt in writing. Don't open the door to Dutch or Peach after dark for any reason. And if they come with the chain, she said. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the south fence through the kitchen window. That afternoon, he said at length, after we set the wire, I'm going to show you something. That afternoon, in the long, flat light before sunset, he set tin cans on the cedar fence posts and showed her how to use the rifle Jonas had left under the bed, the one she had loaded twice in her life, and never fired at anything but a rattlesnake in 1881. He showed her the stance, the breath, the particular patience at the trigger that separates a clean shot from a lucky one. She was a poor shot at first, which was expected. She missed the first 4 cans completely, and on the 5th, she clipped the post instead of the can, and on the 6th, she hit the can squarely, and it flew off the post and landed 6 feet out in the scrub, and she lowered the rifle and looked at it. By the time the light failed, she had hit 7 of the last 10. He collected the remaining cans and looked at her, standing in the long flat light with the rifle at her side. "If anyone comes inside the fence line after dark, and they haven't called out to announce themselves, they are not there for a conversation. And if it's you coming back, 2 whistles, 1 short, 1 long. If you hear 1 whistle, or no whistle at all, shoot first and let me explain myself after." She was checking the sight down the barrel in the failing light, making the kind of small adjustments to her grip that come from starting to own a thing rather than just holding it. He watched her for a moment. There was a quality in her face, a settled, level quality, that he had not entirely expected. In his experience, people in her situation divided almost exactly in half. The ones who went rigid with fear and the ones who went to a kind of deliberate not thinking, both of them ways of not being present to what was happening. Sadie was neither. She was here, in this moment, in this yard, with this rifle, and her face showed it. "You have done this before," she said. "Not a question. More times than I wanted to." She looked at him then over the barrel with the brown level gaze that he had been on the receiving end of across every table in 3 days, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The cedar threw long shadows across the yard. Somewhere past the south fence, a dove called once and stopped. He left at dawn the next morning with the documents in oilcloth in his saddlebag. She stood at the mission gate and watched the gray horse move south until the road bent and the heat shimmer swallowed him. The 3 days he was gone were the longest she had experienced since February. Roper did not try anything direct in those 3 days, which was consistent with his method. Direct action had an unpredictability in it now, and he was a man who controlled his risks. But on the morning of the 2nd day, a man she had not seen before came to the mission front door with a notice of imminent civil seizure, a new filing, a new judge's signature, claiming the debt was in formal default and the property would transfer to the creditor within 48 hours under emergency civil recovery provisions. The man presenting it was polite about it in the way of a person who knows the conversation is already over. Sadie took the document. She read it on the step while he waited. She thanked him, closed the door, wrote the time in her notebook, and set the paper on the table. Then she went to the desk and wrote 2 letters, her own letter to Commissioner Hargrove in Santa Fe, describing the original debt instrument, the chaining, and now the seizure notice, with copies of Jonas's 1880 tax receipts enclosed, and a second letter to the marshal's office in Santa Fe, describing what had happened at the post. She sent both letters with the same boy from the Mexican quarter who knew the back roads, paying him from the jar under the floorboards and telling him not to stop for anyone. Then she loaded the rifle and set it on the table within reach and went back to Jonas's record box. Levi came back on the 4th morning. He came with the daguerreotypes wrapped in flannel and something else, a letter in an official envelope, the seal of the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Santa Fe, which he had received from a rider heading north while still an hour south of town. The letter was addressed to Sadie Coyle and stated that Commissioner Hargrove had received prior correspondence through a contact in Albuquerque, Levi's contact, and that an investigator from his office would arrive in Harlan's Crossing within 10 days to examine the documentation in question, and that pending the outcome of that examination, all civil enforcement actions under the disputed writ were stayed by federal authority, effective immediately. He handed it across the kitchen table. She read it once, sitting very still, then set it flat on the table. She put her coffee cup down. She read it again. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the kind of sustained effort that takes on a shine when it finally gets something to push against. She asked if he could stay 10 days. He looked at the south road visible through the window, the flat heat already on it at 7 in the morning, the particular quality of a road that goes on a long way in both directions, and then he looked at her. He could stay 10 days. They lasted 6. Now, if you want to be here for the second half of this story, this is a good moment to subscribe so the channel can keep bringing you stories like this one. We're about a third of the way through. And while you're thinking about it, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I am always curious who is up late with me. On the 6th night, Roper moved. Roper. He had been patient, but the federal stay had a clock on it, and Roper understood clocks. He waited for a moonless night, which is what a man who plans carefully does, and he sent all 3 enforcers, Peach and Cobb from the south along the rail yard fence, Dutch from the north along the road. The design was simple and reasonable. Levi would hear one approach and turn to face it, and the other would come in behind, and 3 against 1 in the dark is reliable arithmetic. It was reasonable arithmetic against most men. The first thing Dutch encountered, perhaps 20 yards north of the mission gate, was the wire Levi had strung ankle-high between 2 cedar posts. The bottom strand of fence wire rerouted at ground level and staked invisible in the scrub. Dutch went down hard and loud. A man of 220 pounds going down in the dark makes a particular sound, and Levi heard it from the hayloft, where he had not been sleeping for the past 3 hours. He had been listening to the coyotes stop. He moved to the south edge of the loft. Peach and Cobb were crossing the scrub inside the south fence line. Where the wire Levi had staked parallel to the ground was not something they could see. Cobb had a lantern shielded on 3 sides with his coat, leaking just enough light to navigate by. Peach had the chain over his shoulder again, which Levi noted, and a long knife. They were moving slow and careful. Levi put a rifle shot into the dirt 2 feet in front of Peach. In the dark and the silence, the shot was enormous. Both men stopped as completely as if the ground had risen up in front of them. The next one is not in the dirt. From the dark of the loft, at the volume you use across a kitchen table. Both men stood frozen, a long silence in which nothing moved. Cobb, bring the lantern up so I can see your hands. The lantern came up slowly. Coat shield dropped, the light spreading thin and yellow across the scrub. Both of them had their hands visible. Put down what you're carrying. Slow. Cobb set his pistol in the scrub. Peach set the knife down carefully, and then he unlooped the chain from his shoulder and set that down too. The chain landed in the dirt with a particular sound that carried, the sound of iron on dry ground, and Levi heard it and filed it. Walk back the way you came. Don't pick anything up and don't stop walking until you reach the road. They walked back. He tracked them until the dark took them, and then listened until their footsteps on the road faded south. From the north side of the property, silence. Dutch had apparently arrived at his own conclusions about the night's prospects. Levi was down from the loft and crossing the yard when the mission's back door opened and Sadie stepped out with the rifle at her shoulder. The stock settled into the pocket of her arm exactly as he had shown her. She was wearing Jonas's long coat over her nightgown, her dark hair loose, her feet bare on the packed earth of the yard. She lowered the barrel when she picked him out in the darkness. "One whistle," she said. "I forgot." She held the rifle in one hand and stood in the poor light from the kitchen window behind her and looked at him for a moment without speaking. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for long enough that the silence became something else, something with a different quality than ordinary nighttime silence. "Are they gone?" "For tonight." He looked at the south fence, at the darkness beyond it. "I don't think they'll try again tonight. Tomorrow Roper has to decide something different." The federal investigator arrived on the 9th day. His name was Crane, a small bald man from Massachusetts with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather satchel that contained, among other things, a jeweler's loupe considerably more powerful than the one in Sadie's sewing kit. He spread both sets of documents on the kitchen table and went through them for 20 minutes without speaking, the loupe at his eye, moving between the forged instrument and the authentic 1880 records with the methodical unhaste of a man who is building a case in his head while his hands work. Roper was in the room. He had arrived 20 minutes before Crane with his attorney, a Santa Fe lawyer named Price, who had ridden through the night, and the two of them stood near the parlor door while Crane worked. At the end of 20 minutes, Crane set the loupe down, folded his glasses, and looked at Roper. "This document is a forgery," Crane said. His voice was flat and exact. "The ink compound does not correspond to commercial production in New Mexico prior to 1881. The clerk's date notation uses the post-1881 format on a document purportedly executed in autumn of 1880. The notary seal is a reproduction with a 0.5 mm dimensional deviation from the authentic seal visible in these county records." He put his hand on Jonas's 1880 tax receipts. "There is no debt. There is no lawful lien. This enforcement action is invalid in its entirety." Price began to speak. Crane put up one finger, the small, precise gesture of a man with more to say. "Furthermore," Crane said, "I am opening a federal investigation into the origin of this instrument and any related documents bearing similar characteristics, and I am issuing a formal federal stay of all actions taken under this writ, including the civil seizure notice of 6 days ago. Mrs. Coyle is the lawful owner of this property, as she has been continuously since 1877. The room was very quiet. A fly moved against the window screen. The iron stove clicked. Roper, who had spent 42 years calculating which way things would fall before they landed, looked at Cobb. Cobb was looking at the floor with the careful attentiveness of a man who is deciding how much he values his own future. It was Sadie who moved first. She had the forged document in her hand, and she placed it open on the table in front of Roper, turned so the signature was visible. Jonas's name and Cobb's practice copperplate. "Jonas Coyle never signed this paper," she said. Her voice was steady and level. "He was a careful man. He kept every record he made in his own hand. And I have those records. And they do not include this. You put his name on a document to take his land from his widow, and then you chained me in public over it. And I'm going to make sure that everyone in this territory who can read a warrant knows exactly what that means." Roper held her gaze for 4 seconds. Then he looked away. It was the first honest thing he had done in Harlan's Crossing. The federal marshal arrived the following morning. He came from Santa Fe with 2 deputies and Crane's formal report and the authority to act on it. Roper's attorney tried several approaches. The most inventive was the argument that the forgery had been executed without Roper's knowledge or authorization by an overzealous subordinate acting on his own interpretation of the railroad's interests. It was the kind of argument that, in a county court with the right judge, might have taken 3 months to fail. In front of a federal marshal with Crane's report, It took somewhat less time. Cobb had made his own calculation sometime in the previous 12 hours. He was waiting at the marshal's office when the marshal arrived, which suggested he had walked in early that morning before anyone was there to see him arrive. He had a written statement, signed and witnessed by the marshal's Santa Fe clerk, that described 14 months of document preparation in detail, the specific properties, the names of 3 territorial judges who had received cash payments in connection with enforcement actions, the location of 7 additional forged instruments filed against other properties in New Mexico and Arizona territory, the amounts paid per document, and the identity of the Rio Grande Railroad's senior agent in Santa Fe who had authorized the operation. Dutch was arrested that afternoon without incident. He sat down in the marshal's office and looked at the floor with the same expression he had worn on Sadie's front step, and said nothing useful and nothing damaging, and they charged him as a participant and moved on. Peach ran. He made it 1 block east before one of the deputies who had been watching the back of the hotel came around the corner from the other direction. Roper himself was taken in the hotel lobby. He came down the stairs from his room in his good suit, his suitcase already packed, which told you something about how well he had read the morning. The marshal was in the lobby with his 2 deputies and Crane standing off to the side with his satchel. Roper looked at all of them, and at the door, and then at the suitcase in his own hand, and he did the arithmetic one last time. "I would like to speak with my attorney," he said. "He's at the jail already," the marshal said. The afternoon after the arrests, Sadie stood in the mission yard and looked at her land for a long time. The fence lines, the cedar posts Jonas had set by hand, the kitchen garden where the beans were coming in. She stood there until the sun flattened behind the western ridge and the land went long-shadowed and amber, and then she sat down on the mission step and put her hands in her lap. Levi came out of the barn with his saddlebags over his shoulder. The gray horse was at the gate, watching the south road with the directional interest of an animal that knows what a packed saddlebag means. Sadie did not say anything for a moment. He set the bags across the saddle and checked the girth and did not rush the silence. "You could stay." He buckled the near saddlebag and looked at the mission roof. She was right about the roof, and the well rope, and the east fence. There was enough work here for a season, for a man who was willing to stay for it. "Warrants in 4 territories," he said. "The warrants are on a man with no last name who is a long ride from any of those territories." He almost smiled. It was a fraction of a thing, barely there, but she had been watching his face for 10 days and she caught it. It changed him considerably, the way a lamp changes a room. There were other places like Harlan's Crossing, other dead instruments filed by other Cobbs for other Ropers, other families in other towns who had spent 30 days counting the days and writing letters that didn't get answered, who were now standing in their yards watching men with chains come up their road. He had known this the first night, lying in the hayloft with the Colt on the boards, listening to the road. He knew it now. She knew it too. She had known it from the first evening, from the way he talked about his father's step. Some work chooses the man rather than the other way around, and there is no arguing with that kind of choosing. He looked at her. She was sitting on the mission step with her hands in her lap and the long amber light on her face and the 12 acres of her land stretching behind her, and she held his gaze with the same level quality she had brought to every table in 10 days. Not hopeful exactly, not resigned exactly, just present. Here, in this yard, on this land. "Jonas would have liked you," she said. He put his foot in the stirrup. "He sounds like a man who was right about most things." He was. It made him difficult to argue with. She looked at her hands for a moment. I missed that more than I expected. He swung up and touched the brim of his hat. The gray horse shifted and turned. The law is a useful tool, she called after him. The thing Jonas had always said, the Coyle family gospel. In the right hands. He looked back at her over his shoulder from the saddle. You are the right hands, he said. He rode south. She watched the gray horse until the road bent, and the heat shimmer absorbed it, and the sound of the hooves faded into the particular silence of a New Mexico afternoon, the silence of land that is very old, and does not hurry anything, and will still be here long after all of us are finished with it. She went inside and put the coffee on. Now, I want to tell you what happened after, because a story like this one deserves its endings. Roper served 4 years in the federal penitentiary at Fort Leavenworth. His attorney Price was disbarred in 1885 for his conduct in the Santa Fe filing. Cobb received 18 months and a fine in exchange for his cooperation, and he used part of the fine money to pay for a printer's apprenticeship in Denver, which I find improbable, but have confirmed. Dutch served 14 months. Peach served the full sentence and was thereafter not heard from in New Mexico, which is most of what you can hope for from a man like Peach. The 3 territorial judges named in Cobb's statement were removed from their positions within the following year. 1 was criminally charged. 2 were not, which is the kind of justice that has its own particular incompleteness and always will. The federal investigation Crane opened uncovered all 7 of the additional forged instruments Cobb had described. 6 of those properties were restored to their original owners. 1 was not. The chain of ownership had been moved and removed until it was genuinely too tangled to unwind, and the family that had originally owned it received a settlement that did not equal the land, but was at least real. Crane spent another year on that one case, I'm told, before he finally closed the file. It cost him something. The cases that don't fully resolve always do. The railroad spur line was rerouted 8 miles west of Harlan's Crossing. It still runs there. You can hear it on still nights, a long way off, which I have always found strange, and which I have never entirely figured out what to do with. Sadie Coyle kept the 12 acres. She expanded the garden south, she opened the schoolroom 4 days a week, and she hired the boy from the Mexican Quarter as a permanent hand at a wage that was fair. 3 years later, she married a cattle rancher named Hollis from the Cimarron area, a quiet man who had known Jonas from the old days, and who treated her with the specific respect of a person who has read the full story and understands everything that came before. She lived in that mission house for another 41 years. She died in 1924, in the same room Jonas had died in, which she had told her daughter seemed right to her because it was the room where the most history lived. I went looking for Levi twice. In 1886, I followed a rumor to Silver City and found a man who matched the description but would not confirm his name, which was either him being careful or him being someone else. In 1891, I heard of an incident in Tucson involving a mining company's water rights filing and a man who had disputed it with documentation and won, and the description in that account matched down to the gray horse, but I never confirmed it. The warrants expired or were dropped, or the companies that filed them changed names or dissolved, the way companies do when their principals are in federal prison. By about 1895, his name stopped appearing in the wire reports from the Territorial Marshal's office. I like to think he is still out there somewhere on a long road, that there is a woman somewhere who does not yet know she needs him, and a post she does not yet know she will be chained to, and a document that is wrong in ways she will not be able to prove herself. And somewhere south, on a gray horse moving at that unhurried walk, a man who has already seen this kind of paper before is doing the arithmetic and coming north. That is the story of Sadie Coyle and the drifter who cut her free. Summer of 1883, Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory. I was 22 years old and too afraid and too green to do what needed doing, and I have thought about that every day since then. And some days the only comfort in it is knowing that someone else wasn't. Now, this story is a work of fiction made for your entertainment. The characters, the events, and the town of Harlan's Crossing are invented. Any resemblance to real people or real history is coincidental. The story was written and produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence tools. If this story held you tonight, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and I am always glad to know who is up late with me. Thank you for being here.